This is an episode about the epic friendship between two women. One that transcends marriages and divorce and miscarriage and sex, so much sex, and ends in the most poignant, tragic and beautiful way.
Hi! Hi!
How are you, my love?
I'm so good. Yay!
So good to talk to you.
It's so nice to see you. Okay, I don't have to do anything. I'm not used to not being in charge. I'm like, I just show up.
Tell me about it. It's a podcast host off. It starts when your best friend, your person, gets a life-changing diagnosis. She's 41 and she's married. But instead of living out the life that she's built, she decides to leave her 15-year marriage so she can go and have hot and sometimes kinky sex with strangers. Dozens of them. What do? Do you judge her? Encourage her? Do you support her? Or do you distance yourself? Maybe you help her pick up guys. Well, if you're my guest today, you make a hit podcast with her.
So his hand was there and I was like, I know that
where it's going.
Yeah, I know where it's going.
And you were okay with it.
I was okay with it. And but at one point I was like, I need to acknowledge that I know that he knows that I know that we all know what's going on. So I go, I sounded like a prepubescent boy. I was like, no, I'm not expecting this, Like, I think my voice went.
From Mamma Mia, I'm Mia Freedman, and you're listening to No Filter, a weekly interview podcast with people who tell their stories very candidly and who aren't afraid to be all kinds of vulnerable. Today, I'm speaking to someone who really is the epitome of candid and vulnerable in our conversation. Her name is Nikki Boyer. She's an actress, and she is the voice and the host of the cult podcast, Dying for Sex. It's a 6-part series that follows the story of Molly, who is Nikki's best friend, who is dealing with that age-old question, what do you do with the time that you have left? Nikki and Molly's friendship celebrates life. From hilarious sex stories,
dates at 6 a.m, dates at 2 a.m, dates at 9 a.m, at noon, one at 6 p.m. I mean,
to dealing with the loss of your person.
I miss her in ways that I didn't even think were possible.
Here is my beautiful conversation with Nikki Boyer. Nikki, how did you and Molly meet?
Molly and I met, 20-something years ago in an acting class in Los Angeles. And we met in a dirty little studio. I don't want to say dirty. It was kind of dirty. It was dark, and that smell that a theater has, where it hasn't probably really properly been cleaned in quite a long time, but it's got that musty smell to it. Yeah, and so we met in a studio for an acting class that. It was on Melrose Avenue, which is where everybody wanted to go to acting class. So that's where we met in a studio. dark room, no windows.
Where were you both at in your lives when you met? And did you hit it off straight away, or was it like a slow burn friendship?
She hated me when she met me. She couldn't stand me, right? I thought she was sweet and kind, and who's that girl? But she looked at me like, who's that girl seeking all the attention in the room? And I'm like, of course, that's me. I had just moved to LA. Of course, I literally parked my car, got here, and signed up for an acting class because I was such a overzealous type A. And Molly had been here for maybe a year and decided to embark on an acting class and see what that did for her. And it was a slow burn. I have to thank the teacher that paired us up in a scene, scene study and acting class. They give you a scene, you go work on it and you bring it back. And if that woman Heidi wouldn't have paired Molly and myself up in a scene, I don't know if I'd be telling the story today, because we wouldn't have naturally gravitated to each other. So that scene sort of forced us into working together, communicating. And then I'll never forget the moment I realized that we were kind of cut from the same cloth, as we had a little inside joke going on, and it went on and on to the point where it was obnoxious and annoying. And I was like, oh, she's my people. And so that's how it came about.
Did you both want to be actors then?
Yeah, we both did. She got over it very quickly. I think after like the 7th or 8th class, she was like, okay, that's enough for me. I got bit by the bug, and to this day, I still do acting.
How old were you both at the time?
I was 22 22 and she was 23, I think. So at the time I felt very well seasoned and smart and ready. And I look back and I'm like, we were infants. Like our brains weren't even fully developed yet. But we were in our very early 20s and very wide-eyed and ready for whatever.
And you know how when you meet someone and there's that platonic chemistry and there's banter and you sort of go on dates in terms of, you know, do you want to grab a drink or do you want to have dinner? How long did it take your friendship to develop until you were kind of each other's person?
Ooh, God, that's a great question. I would say not long. So after we did that scene together and I got to sort of see where she lived and she saw where I lived, she very quickly became a staple in my life. I was working at the time. I was waiting tables and trying to go to auditions. And I was a very aggressive, like, I got to get things done. Molly was a little more chill and relaxed, right? So she had a lot of free time. So she'd say, let's have lunch. And we'd have lunch and she'd say, well, then can I come to your audition with you? And she'd ride in the car with me and we'd go to the audition and she'd say, well, do you want to have coffee after? And I'd be like, this is amazing. I've got like a partner with me in my car all day that's willing to go run errands. And she just wanted companionship and to be with me. And I had a lot going on. So she was like this perfect fit. So very quickly we became each other's person and started to have a shorthand and an understanding. And she was a digger. She'd ask questions and she wanted to know you, the dirty, the ugly, the messy parts, as well as the beautiful parts. And that was really interesting for me as one of my first friendships in Los Angeles.
Was she married then?
No, she was not. She was single. She was dating a couple of dudes. I was dating a couple of dudes. And I think I had just about met my ex-husband. So she's been with me during boyfriends, girlfriends, ex-husbands, new boyfriends, stepkid. Like we've been in it for a while together. We had been. I still talk about her like she's still here. I know.
You do. It's so interesting. And I want to ask you about that in a minute. But do you remember when she called you after she'd been to the doctor? Or do you remember when she found the lump in her breast?
I do remember, it was funny you ask that because I do remember it because we shared the same OBGYN and we both thought he was kind of handsome, right? So that's weird. I've never had like a hot OBGYN. He ended up being a real douchebag because she did feel something in her breast. And at the time, she didn't even bring it up to me, I think because she trusted him so much that she thought, well, if he is saying this is nothing and don't worry about it, you don't need a mammogram, then I think she thought, oh, okay, I feel like I got good advice. And so she never really brought it up to me or had a concern. And then, you know, down the line, realizing that she had breast cancer, that's when we started talking about it and hashing it out and discussing our bad experiences with this particular doctor and how he was really caught up in sort of the Hollywood scene instead of being caught up with the well-being of his patients.
She writes about that in her book when she says he was very dismissive when she said she had a lump and said, you're too young to have breast cancer, don't be silly. How old was she?
I want to say she was, 32 at the time. I might be wrong. Sometimes I get the dates a little mushy, but it was around that early 30s time. And, you know, we talked about it a lot of why didn't she just trust her own gut? Why didn't she go get a mammogram? Why didn't she request a second opinion? But I think you'll gather if you read her book and you understand her, she really trusted people that she felt like had an authority in her life and had to sort of kind of got lost in that dynamic sometimes and trusting sort of the male in her life that's telling her this is fine, this is okay. And I didn't really fully grasp that until after I spent time with her book that she just struggled sometimes finding her voice and sticking up for herself, especially when you're 32 and your doctor says, don't worry about it. I mean, literally said, you're too young for breast cancer. So every time I tell this story, if you're out there and you're listening, please get a mammogram. Even if you don't have any signs, it's early detection is so important. I don't care how old you are. Get a mammogram. Get it every year, please.
And if you find something and your doctor says, oh, don't worry about it, you can still ask for a screening test. You can still say, no, you know what, just to keep my mind at rest, I'd like to get an ultrasound or I'd like to get a mammogram.
Agreed.
How many years after that was she diagnosed and how did it happen?
You know, So she was diagnosed a few years after that, and it was, I believe, stage 3 at the time. So it had progressed very quickly within some years. I want to say it was 2012. Gosh. So looking back, when she called me and said, I have cancer, I just remember it wasn't computing in my brain. And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, she's going to have such a long road, but I never once thought that she wouldn't beat it. And she did. She had a double mastectomy. She lost all of her hair. She went through chemo, hormone treatments, the whole 9 yards. And I remember she was very private about it. Nobody knew she had breast cancer. There were a very select amount of people. And so her husband at the time was very much her caretaker and took her to her appointments. And I don't remember being as involved in her diagnosis as I was the second time. But it was really hard to see someone that I just assumed would never get sick or never be ill or never lose her hair, and to know that it was, the trickle down of what the doctor did was really hard for me to wrap my brain around, because I was part of that dynamic. I was still a part of, going, and I had to tell all of my friends who were going to this particular OBGYN, like, please, all of you stop going. Like, this is not good. So yeah.
Did she get angry?
Yeah. She got very angry. In fact, we were trying to plot things that we could do to this particular doctor, like really mature things, like egg his home, slash his tires, things that grown women do. Yeah. But we did share the story with a lot of people, and he did lose a lot of patients, but he's still practicing and still featured on, housewife shows, and he still looked at as a doctor in Beverly Hills. And honestly, it kind of turns my stomach. I hope, we're all human. We all make mistakes. I hope he's learned from this, and I hope he's saved some lives, because he did not do that for Molly.
How did her cancer impact her relationship with her husband? What did she tell you about it during that time?
I think it bonded them in the beginning. It glued them together, because he was such a caregiver, caretaker. He was really good at organizing, being in charge, facilitating appointments, driving to appointments. They bonded very, very much during that time. I do think that it exacerbated sort of the problems that they were also having. So I think it highlighted the bad and the good within their relationship, but it definitely bonded them and it tethered them together. That I think is what made it so painful when Molly left, because he felt such a bond, and so did she, but she was ready for that. She was ready for that to be finished. I know he is, I don't want to paint him as anything other than just doing the best that he could, but she could not discover who she was in the context of that marriage. And so she got out eventually.
She had a double mastectomy and a breast reconstruction. Did she talk to you about how she was feeling about her body and her new breasts and how it impacted on her sort of sexuality?
Yeah, Molly never liked her boobs. She was always very self-conscious. She'd always say, show me your boobs. I want to see what good boobs look like. And I want boobs like yours. So
why didn't she like her boobs?
Yeah, they were, let's be like for real.
Let's talk about Molly's boobs.
Molly would love to know that we were talking about her boobs. She would she would love this right now. She didn't like the way they sat on her body. She didn't like the way they were shaped. She thought they were too tiny and too small. She was always very self-conscious of them. And, I think she had a lot of self-conscious issues with her body, the same that I had at that age. And I remember she would look at my boobs and say, oh my gosh, I want boobs like that. So when it came down to her double mastectomy and then reconstruction, it was horrible on her body, painful, awful. They have to stretch the skin. I think her breast reconstruction was one of the first where they actually salvaged her nipples and kept her actual nipples intact. So it was kind of an experimental surgery, and it worked. And her breasts look amazing when they were finished. But the price that she paid to get that, she always would joke about it, like that they lobbed off every part of her that felt like a woman, right? The cancer had taken away her ability to have children, which, she wanted the choice. I don't think she really wanted kids, but she wanted to make that choice herself. Yeah. It took away her periods. Her hormones were all messed up, her lymph nodes and her breasts. And so I think when they were reconstructed, she did feel a little like Humpty Dumpty, right? Like she felt like she was putting herself a little bit back together and felt very confident in her body, more so than I think she had ever felt pre-cancer. So
How did she choose what size to go?
she wanted them to look like mine, which is so funny. So
What size are you? Did you have to go to appointments and say, can you make some like this, please?
So I did. I went to one appointment and
You're a good friend.
I know. And what's funny is that I don't have large breasts. I just have very tiny, perky, normal breasts. But it's so funny. I've never talked about my boobs more in my life. But she got a bigger size than me. I was like, go a little tiny bit bigger. She did not go. I mean, Molly was a very tiny framed woman, so she went with something that felt like it would suit her body, and she was really proud of them because she was very involved in it. Like she was her own advocate when it came to medication, what they were putting in her body, what the combinations of medications were, what the side effects were. Was the risk worth the reward? Like she was very tuned in, and she was her own advocate, even when it came down to her breast surgery. So yeah.
She took control of the uncontrollable.
That's a great way to put it. And it was a reclaiming time for her. Like it didn't just start with the sex part. I think the reclaiming started with being her own advocate and not letting a bunch of, not to make this gender specific, but not letting a bunch of dudes in white coats sort of dictate what was going to happen with her body. She was ready to start making some choices on her own.
She'd had the reconstruction. She was going through some issues in her marriage. They were having therapy together. What were the signs that the cancer was back? What made her investigate?
So I remember this. I remember where she was living, and she called me. I even remember where I was sitting that day. It's weird. It's like it was yesterday. The sun was shining, and I was sitting at my desk, and she called me and said, I'm leaving my condo or my house right now. I'm going to go work out, but my hip is really bothering me. Like really, she had hired a trainer. She was getting her strength back. And I remember, I didn't know it at the time, but now looking back, I kind of remember feeling a flicker of something like, oh no. But I thought, maybe it's just you overworked it. And she said, I'm going to go work out today. I'm going to rest it, but I'm going to go get it checked out just to be safe. And when she went and got her tests done and her screenings done, they found it was in her liver, in her brain, in her lungs, I believe, and in her bones. And it was devastating because she thought she had beat it, she thought she had really put it to rest. So it was back, and it was back at stage 4.
She got the call while she was in the middle of a therapy session, and the story she tells about it is tragically hilarious in terms of her husband's reaction, or her then husband's reaction.
Right. So yeah, I always feel bad regurgitating the story a little bit because it's Molly's story to tell, but now I'm her voice, right? Like it's for me to tell. But I don't know all sides of the story. I know Molly's side, and that's the story that I'm telling. And if somebody else wants to tell their side of the story, they can get a podcast and write a book, right? That's what I say. But with Molly, she was in therapy. They were working on some communication stuff, and she got the call, and I think she was waiting for that call. I mean, could you imagine sitting and waiting for, that kind of a result to come? So she was in therapy and got the call that it was metastatic, and that she specifically said that means there's no cure for this. And this is most likely what I'm going to die from. And the doctor was very honest with her, and she just crumbled and lost it in the middle of her session, and then sat back down. And then, according to Molly, her husband said, Can we get back to the session? Can we get back to why I'm angry? And I think in that moment, she knew in her brain and in her body that she was ready to leave this relationship, and she was creating her exit strategy from that moment on.
You were in a pretty unique position to understand what she was going through, right? Because you'd lost your father, and your brother had also faced cancer. So you knew the ropes. Did that help in helping her through what was to come?
In some ways, yes. I was well versed at appointments and uncomfortable conversations and talking about the elephant in the room. And I was used to watching that process. Oddly enough, I've watched a lot of people die. Very weird. But so it gave me a sort of I don't even want to say confidence. That's a weird word, but a lot of people are uncomfortable talking about death, but I felt very comfortable and confident saying like, this is a part of life and we need to address it. So I had this odd sense of like, I don't know, ownership over like, I know what this is like and I'm going to do this with you. I don't know if that makes sense. I'm saying it out loud. It makes sense in my head, but I may not be articulating it right.
No, it does.
Okay.
No, it definitely does, because all you can do is bear witness, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And then in terms of, you would think after watching my father die and watching my brother go through cancer and other family members pass from this, that I would have a reality check, like knowing this is not probably going to get better. But for some reason with Molly, I just thought somehow she would defy all of the odds because I thought she was so special. So I thought, well, gosh, she's got so much to give and she's finally figuring out what she wants to do and say in the world. And this isn't going to take her anytime soon. So we'd always laugh and we'd say, I'd say, you're dying. And she'd say, well, aren't we all? And then she would say things like, well, I could live longer than you. I could live longer than anybody that we're looking at. I don't think we understood how much the clock was ticking until she went into the hospital for that last time.
Well, she was not behaving like a person who was dying. I mean, the first thing she did was leave her husband, which is not really what I would think of doing. How did that, what was your reaction when she said, I'm out of here?
I didn't even think twice about it. I thought, well, yeah. The thing that did strike me was that he was very much her sort of healthcare person, right? And I thought, well, how is she going to navigate this? And when I asked her, she said, well, there's Uber. I was like, and I said to her, I love you. I will be there for you, but I cannot be your person in that way. I've got 2 jobs. I've got 2 stepdaughters. I've got a family, a life. I said, you are such a huge part of my life. But I was very honest with her and told her my limitations of what I could and couldn't do. And I knew I could have that chat with her because of how close we were.
Nikki, you are very good with boundaries.
Oh.
Because I was thinking most people would go, I'll be there for you. I'll do whatever it takes. But you were like, here's when I'm available. And also there's Uber.
Now listen, when she knew that when she called me and needed me, she knew that if she was going to exercise that option and say, I need you, that I knew she meant it. Like there was no crying wolf here, right? Like she knew that when she needed me, I was going to drop whatever, however, to be there for her. And I did quite often because that was just, I wanted to. It made me feel close to her and useful in the world. And I was her person. And she was my person in a way. I always laugh that I always say I was Molly's person. But now that she's gone, I'm realizing, how much of my person that she really was, because I miss her in ways that I didn't even think were possible. Whew.
It still comes, the grief, right?
Oh, gosh.
The waves.
Yeah.
How many years has it been now?
It was a year when the podcast was released. So this past February, March, April, May, June.
It's like July. A year and a half. Oh, my
gosh, a year and a half. It feels like yesterday and it feels like a million years ago, all wrapped up in one, right?
I feel like the fact that you were so good with boundaries is incredibly impressive and was incredibly important for your relationship to be able to stay as equal as it was and to be able to stay as a friendship. Like you weren't her carer. So, you know, that from what I can glean about your friendship from listening to the podcast, you stayed on a very equal footing throughout her illness.
Yeah, that's a beautiful thing to get. I don't know if I ever realized that, but thank you for saying that. We did. And that was for both of us did that together. We made sure we both did that because we didn't want to turn into a bad marriage. We wanted to be like the best friends possible, you know?
When did the sex start happening?
Oh, right. But I can tell you, this is exactly how mine and Molly's chats would go. We'd be sobbing at the table. And then I would say, so can we get back to the large penis that you saw on Thursday? And she'd be like, happily. I was as grateful to the sex as she was because it was such a nice distraction from talks about chemo and pills and puking and, and your body falling apart. It was a nice distraction. So the sex started before she left. Well, virtually it started before she left her marriage. And she asked him for permission if she could go about that. And he was very willing to allow her to sort of tap back into that sexual part of herself. And then she realized she wanted to take it into real life and she did not want to be a cheater. And I think when she was diagnosed as terminal, knowing that she wanted that part of herself to feel alive again, she knew it was time to leave the marriage. So as soon as she left the marriage, she started dating she started dating like she was dying. Like she went for it. I mean, dates at 6 a.m, dates at 2 a.m, dates at 9 a.m, at noon, one at 6 p.m. I mean, she was a serial dater. It was crazy.
Wow. And did she, before she started dating in real life, I've looked at the photos she took because her Instagram account is still up.
Yeah.
And those shots of her, she was you could really see how she was reclaiming her body and her identity as a sexual being after cancer or through cancer and after ending her marriage. And that was enough for her for a while, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm. It was. Yeah.
Until it wasn't.
I think at first it was about a reclaiming of her body and not being seen through the lens of cancer. I think it's part of the reason why she kept her cancer so private is she didn't want to be seen as only that. And that happens often. I mean, when someone that has cancer walks into a party, the first thing you do is,
How
like
are
you feel, yeah. And she didn't want
head
that.
tilt.
So, exactly.
How are you?
And I think she appreciated that, but that's not how she wanted to be seen. So she would take these really sexy selfies, like super erotic looking selfies that were Instagram friendly. And she'd post them, but she'd couple them with these statements that were honest statements, like what she had been going through, what it's like to have a port in her arm and trying to hide it so that the sexy selfie can be sexy and not, medical equipment. And she would be honest and say, some days I'm on the bathroom floor, taking a selfie and looking erotic. And other days I'm on the bathroom floor because I can't get off of it because I'm so fatigued. But she wanted to start dipping her toe into that. And so she started going on apps, Bumble. Look at me. I'm like, what's it called? Bumble and Tinder. I'm a serial monogamist. So I just go from one relationship to the next, right? I didn't have time to date. I was too busy making people commit to me. Anyway, that's a book in and of itself. But Molly was really great at just like meeting people where they were, seeing guys that had these interesting fetishes, talking to them on Tinder, talking to them on OkCupid. And really, there's an underbelly of sex that goes on all of these apps that I didn't know about.
There is. Yeah, let's revisit some of those. The couple in the bar that she met.
I think that was the second or third thing she had done in real life. And, she'd always been like, oh, should I date women? Should I try it with a woman? And I'm like, well, do you have interest? And she's like, no, but I'm going to do it anyway. I'm like, oh, okay. So she met a couple in a bar that's actually right up the street from where she was living and where I was living. So this was all happening in the same neighborhood, which is funny because I would take my stepdaughters to lunch at the same little pub where Molly was like doing things in the parking lot. And I was like, this is so weird and amazing. She dated a couple for a minute, made out with the woman in the bathroom and was like, yeah, this is not hot. And then while she was ending that date, she was starting another date via her phone that she was heading to go meet and exchanging, pictures back and forth with the guy while she was basically telling this couple like, hey, this was really hot, but I gotta go. So she was multitasking like a badass.
The other episode from the podcast that I love is, I can't remember if it was at the end of that actual date where she goes to the car with the guy to make out.
Yes, that was in the same exact neighborhood at the same exact bar. In fact, I've tried to get this bar to sponsor something because I'm like, do you know what went on at your bar?
There needs to be a plaque, Nikki, at the bar. Definitely.
That's so funny. Well, what's funny is that I called the bar not that long ago to say, could we do something together? And the bartender goes, oh, Molly? And I was like, what? He goes, yeah, we have listened to the podcast. We remember Molly. And I'm like, oh my gosh,
wow.
this is another episode to record with these guys. All these bartenders knew who she was because she frequented so often, and she never ordered a drink because she wasn't a drinker. So they knew she was a club soda and lime girl.
Oh.
So she hooked up with this guy. I think he might have been the first. She hooks up with him. They go to the car. They start, making out pretty hot and heavy. I think her top came off and his pants came down. And the next thing you know, I think she's giving him oral sex. I think that's what was going on. Yeah. And then he started to get super aroused, didn't quite know what to do with it. So he opened the car door and just sort of let it all,
Into
into the lawn, right? I don't know how graphic we can get here.
Oh, very. That's fine. Onto the lawn, which is an interesting choice.
Right? But in the midst of it, his car alarm starts to go off very loudly in a very private, high-end neighborhood. So as he's sort of unloading his thing into
Life force.
Well-manicured lawn, the alarms, and he can't figure out how to turn off the alarm, and it is blaring, and it is a mess. And the beauty of this is that she never saw him again. We record the podcast, a few years later, we recorded and start talking about this episode. And then when Molly went into the hospital, I realized, we're not going to be able to finish this podcast together. And then he appeared on I called him out of the blue, and to have him come on the podcast and be so willing to sort of air his dirty laundry. He and I are still friends. We still communicate, and I adore him.
He was such a good sport because she hadn't told him that she was sick, and he was so lovely and open to having a chat about it when you called.
I know. He was just he's like one of my favorite people. And we did meet for coffee and we hung out, and I just kept thinking, Molly has no idea the people that she's brought together and the stories. And it was one of those moments where I was like, oh my gosh, this is where Molly and I used to have coffee. And now I'm having coffee with car alarm guy instead of Molly. But we're talking about Molly. It was just all very, very cool.
One time you went to her house and she had like makeup down one side of her face. Like red, white, and blue makeup?
Yeah, it was very it was contouring on a whole new. I was like, what is that color? I don't think that. But she's like, oh my gosh, she was in a little nightie, and she was just looked like she had like gone to the circus, and she kind of had. And I said, where were you? And she said, oh, I was making out with a clown. And I said, like, where? And she's like, well, he was working, and then we hooked up, and we just went for it. He wanted to have sex with me while dressed as a clown. And I said, and you went with it? And she's like, oh yeah, it was good. She's like, it was good. I'm like, oh, okay. So yeah, it was smeared down her face, and her really light, like you said, she had really blonde hair, and it was in her hair. It was red and blue. And I was like, oh my gosh. But that was Molly. I mean, she was just up for a lot. She was up for anything.
She was very completely non-judgmental and ended up hooking up with guys and learning quite a lot about different fetishes.
Yeah.
The most perverse one was the guy who wanted her to kick him.
Really hard multiple times over and over again in the nuts, which I just thought was fascinating because isn't that like the most painful thing that can happen to a guy? But
you would
so
think.
I asked her, I had a lot of questions. I mean, this was probably a 6-hour lunch one day when we just sat and I wrote down all these stories because I was like, oh my gosh, there is something here. So yeah, the guy just wanted to be kicked multiple times over and over and over again. And he didn't sort of climax or anything. But she had described it as sort of spank bank material that he would carry with him for later in his sex life. But there was something about being tortured in pain, kicked by a woman in heels or in bare feet that was just very erotic to him. I had to get over a lot of my judgment because I was like, what? Why? Who? Where? No. No. It doesn't make any sense. Like, no.
Did these things turn her on, or she was more just almost like a wildlife documentary, just learning about people and sex and different things?
You know, it's funny you say that because a lot of responses were, well, wow, Molly was just being of service to people and doing things for others and not necessarily for herself. And that does fall in line with a little bit of who Molly was, where she would get a little lost sometimes in a dynamic and she would just be such a good listener and so much of service that maybe she wouldn't figure out her own needs or her own wants. And I think as she got more experienced, she realized how to learn things about herself within the dynamic of that. She wasn't interested in being a dominatrix, but she tried it, right? She wasn't interested in certain fetishes, but she was really interested in the people behind the fetishes, the humans underneath it. And so, yes, a lot of it was sex-based, but I think a lot of it was human-based. She was just like absorbing all of it, and in the process feeling really sexy and connected to her sexuality and to her body, that she was robbed of that as a younger girl and a woman. And I think there was a reclaiming happening. The sex needed to come, and then the emotional stuff was able to come after. And I think she learned that when she was reflecting on her life from her hospital bed.
There's a point in your story and your friendship where she's invited to go to New York to be in a breast cancer fashion parade.
Yeah.
And she thinks that it's going to be really great, and her mum, I think, still lives in New York, and you went with her, and it turned out to be quite a dark time, didn't it?
It did. It was, in the midst of it, I was just being of service, helping, and kind of on autopilot a little bit. About halfway through the trip, I realized that this was not turning out the way that we both had hoped. We looked at it as an opportunity for the two of us to go to New York, stay in her childhood home, go to these parties, be in Fashion Week. And when she got there, she wasn't feeling great. A lot of it was emotional. I think going back to New York was hard on her. I think that city carried a lot of sadness and grief for her that she maybe had forgotten about over the years. And I also think that, she wanted a sense of community in the breast cancer world, but never quite knew how to find it with other women, because she wanted to be seen, but not. She wanted to be heard, but not. So she was constantly didn't know where to land. And I think that it was the first time she had gone public about having breast cancer on a stage in front of thousands of people walking the catwalk as a badass. But I guess I kept seeing the younger girl and her sort of crumbling, because it was a lot. I think it was a lot more than she or I or her mom had expected. And so that was a really hard trip. On our friendship, it was hard. It was like our first really big fight. I was also going through my own personal stuff. I was pregnant at the time. And I don't even know if I've ever said that out loud. Maybe I have, but I was pregnant, and I think it was probably my 4th or 5th pregnancy. So I had lost all of my pregnancies, all of them, and very late into the pregnancies. So here I was pregnant again, feeling hopeful but terrified, and going on an airplane to support my best friend with cancer. And I was emotional, she was emotional, and it was kind of a recipe for disaster. And we went through a lot during that weekend. It was really, really dark. Beautiful moments too. Beautiful moments too.
Your fight about?
It was so stupid.
It usually is.
Right? Like, I'm not a good, my fiance always says to me, like, you're not a good closer. Like, I will be a rock star, but then like the last mile of the race, I'm like, oh, F this. So I'm like the worst. So I had flown there with her. We had stayed at her place. We had sort of battled this thing together. And then on her way home, she was just exhausted and tired. And we got to the airport in Burbank, and she couldn't lift her bags and all this. And I shouldn't have been lifting anything either, because I was pregnant and terrified of losing another baby that I did end up losing, by the way.
So sorry.
Thank you. So we get off of the flight, and my stepdaughters and my dog and my fiance are coming to pick me up. And Molly says, do you think I could have a ride home? And I thought, oh my gosh, I don't know how we're going to fit everybody in the car. And I said, they're all coming to pick me up, and you live opposite. And it was one of those moments where I was like, I felt tapped out. Yeah. And I just said, I can't give you a ride home. The kids are in the car. And she kind of rolled her eyes and got upset with me, And I snapped, and I was like, it was pouring down rain. She's so sick and frail, and she's holding her bags. And I said, call an Uber. I can't deal with this. And I think I said something really shitty and walked away from her and left her basically standing in the rain with her bag, very sick and exhausted. And that was our first real like FU fight. Like, I'm tired of this shit. And we didn't talk for 2 weeks, and that was the longest we had ever gone without talking. But we hashed it out on the phone and really like aired our grievances and moved on. It kind of brought us closer, because I feel like once you have your first real fight with a friend, that was kind of our first fight. It was like 20 years in the making.
You have to be very connected and feel very safe in your relationship to have a fight like that.
Yeah. And I still feel bad about leaving her in the rain. Like, that image I won't ever forget of just abandoning her. But she pissed me off. So
yeah,
I was mad. There it is.
When did you find out about what had happened to her as a kid? And how did that change the way you looked at her whole sexual adventure?
You know, her sexual trauma, I always knew about it because she told me very early on in our friendship. But my 20-year-old self, I think, absorbed it very differently than my 40-year-old self. So I just kind of took it as, oh, that's information about her, and that must have been very difficult and so hard. But not until, and you know, it's funny, when she started doing the sex, right? Like having crazy amounts of sex, I didn't really, I didn't want to say, oh, this must be because of your trauma, right? Like, who am I to say that? I don't know what this is. I just supported her through all of it, no matter what it was. Like, who cares where it comes from? If you have to go through it, you have to go through it. So I thought a lot of it was a reclaiming of her body. I thought a lot of it was sowing some oats. She had an adverse reaction to the medication, which most people, when they do this sort of hormone therapy in their cancer journey, it shuts everything down. But for her, she was like vibrating and alive. So whether or not she was sexually abused as a child or not, I felt like this is what she needs to go through. And I supported it for two reasons. One, because who am I to judge somebody else's journey? And it was fun. And I saw her feel alive, and I saw her processing things and getting excited about life and being excited about how she looked and felt in the world. And it wasn't all pretty. There were some real messy, uncomfortable things that went down during these sexcapades. But I just always trusted her, and I trusted that she knew her limitations and what she could and couldn't do. And even though she had been through trauma, I trusted that she was protecting herself and taking care of herself. I would get worried, but I always knew that, I don't know, I always knew she'd be okay.
Were you worried for her physical safety? Like hooking up with these random guys, the clowns and the nut kicker and...
You know, it's funny. Occasionally, like, there were times where I'd say, could you text me when you get home just so I know you're safe, right? And also, I mean, she's, you know, she's a New York girl, right? I mean, she's an Upper West Side New York girl. I'm from St. Louis. Like, I can kick some serious ass. And like, she, you know, she knows how to, you know.
Well, she knows how to kick someone in the nuts now. We know that.
True. That's so true. So I kind of always knew that she was going to be okay. There were a couple times where I was a little like, hey, Molly, let's maybe not. Let's be a little safer. And she'd be like, I know. But overall, I felt like what she was doing, you say that I'm good at boundaries. Molly was great, I think, with some boundaries within herself. There were times she found herself not great with boundaries, but overall, in this journey, I think she really knew how to tune in with herself and how to have conversations with herself to say, this is starting to feel like old stuff. This is starting to feel like trauma, and this is feeling like being alive. I think she could tell the difference. And as she went on and had more sexual encounters, the more she learned about herself. And I thought that was pretty empowering.
When she went into hospital for that final time, she didn't realize that it was going to be the final time. She thought she was just going to have a procedure and then come out. Yeah. When did her head turn from the sex to wanting to tell her story about what had happened to her as a kid and her life?
Well, Molly always wanted to tell her story and write a book, right? Even before the cancer and before all of this happened. I think she always had a drive to share. She was a wonderful writer, but I think was afraid to be seen, afraid to be heard, yet desperately wanted to be seen and heard at the same time. So that dance was going on for her. But when she entered the hospital, by the way, you ask the best questions. I just love you. This is so wonderful. I feel like this is therapy. What do I owe you? When she entered the hospital, it was a couple of months into her stay. I mean, she was there December, January, February, almost 4 months. there were still like a month and a half into her hospital stay, she still thought she was getting out and going to get better. And she was still sort of having suitors come visit her and watch movies in her hospital room and sexting a little bit. I mean, she was still, in the very beginning, she was still like doing it and working it and still holding on to that. And then
at one
when
point, a guy comes and does she give him a blowjob? Like something?
Yes, oh God, that's right. Yes, yes. He came to visit. He was so handsome and so cute. And he came to visit. And when she told me the story, I immediately did the eye roll, which was like, oh my God, what a douchebag. He shows up to the hospital. You give him oral sex. And then he's like, ow, I'm see you later. Peace out. But then once I got to know him, because he came on the podcast as well, once I got to know him and understand more about him, it was actually not what I thought. He came in, they snuggled up in bed. She said he took his clothes off so that he wouldn't contaminate, the bedroom. And I thought, oh, really? That's why he took his clothes off? That's so cute. But then after I talked to him and kind of got to know him, I really do think that that's what he was being so respectful and like kind and loving. And when I told him that she had, he when we finally had the conversation, he had revealed that he knew she had passed away. He was devastated and heartbroken. And I think in that moment with that conversation with him on the podcast, I fully realized how deeply she touched these people that she would have these sexual journeys with. It wasn't just a blowjob in the hospital. I mean, that's fun to say, but I think it was really something deeper and more connected because Molly was a very special creature. She would get you to open up and reveal your deepest, darkest things about yourself. And she made you feel heard and seen and safe. And so I think that's when she started to realize, like, I have the capacity to have an emotional and a sexual relationship at the same time. And by that time, she wasn't getting out of the hospital. So, yeah.
You didn't expect for her to die when you started making the podcast together, even though, ironically, it was called Dying for Sex. You thought it was going to end in a different way. How did you think it was going to go?
So I thought that we'd do like a season 2, right? We did season 1, which was all about like the sexcapades. And then I thought season 2, we would get into my story, which is the fertility, because Molly beautifully said once, like, I'm fighting for my life at the exact same time that you're fighting to make a life. And we were going through surgeries at the same time. I was going through miscarriages while she was in the hospital. We were FaceTiming with like our IVs in. I mean, we were really going through this. And she would always say to me, this is your version of cancer. And she never made me feel badly for saying, I would say, oh my God, you're dealing with cancer and I'm just dealing with this. And she always made it feel very much like we were going through this together. So I thought there'd be a season 2. And I thought there'd be a season where we could talk about the trauma, the sexual trauma. And I don't know. I thought, her doctors told her, like, you have years, not decades. So in my mind, I go to, okay, she's got 9 years. We've got 9 more years together, right? And I think she actually thought she had a chunk of time. And I think when she went into that hospital, I don't think any of us prepared for it to be, because she had defied so many odds. I don't think we were prepared for that to be her last hospital visit.
How did you then decide what to do with the rest of the show?
Well, we had been trying to find someone to, distribute her story, knowing that there would be a season 2. And then once she got into the hospital and I realized she wasn't coming out, it was my mission to tell her story. And I didn't know how to do it, but I just knew that I was just maybe it's going to release the episodes that we had recorded on my YouTube channel or wherever. I just had to get them heard. But then when I realized that she wasn't going to be getting out and that the end was much closer than I had anticipated, I asked her if she'd be willing to record from her hospital bed, and she was very open to it. So we recorded a couple of episodes, just she and I on my phone with a little microphone attached from her bed. And then I was getting ready to release the episodes. I believe that she was still here, and I wanted to release the episodes because I wanted her to know that they were out there. I just wanted her to know. And then I decided to send an email to Wondery, who helped me produce the podcast and gave this thing wings. I decided to reach out again because I hadn't heard back from them. I thought, gosh, they're not responding. Okay, I know, this is Hollywood. Nobody responds to anything in this town. And so I gave it one more shot, and I sent an email and I said, before I self-publish this, I just wanted to make sure you're passing on this project. And then the CEO of the company responded and said, I never got the email. And I'm so glad you reached back out. So I had a meeting with him, and he came to the hospital and met Molly on Valentine's Day and spent an hour with her, an hour or so, just sitting with her and promising that he would tell her story. And so we worked for a whole year after Molly had passed to really get this story told right. And we launched it almost a year to her passing, almost the anniversary of her passing, which felt very important to me.
I'm not surprised that the grief's coming back in a new wave, because I imagine that time was like keeping her alive for you and keeping your friendship alive. And now it's out, and then it's out in the world, and then you're getting everybody's feedback about it. And it's like, I guess the hole is there now. When do you notice it the most?
In the mornings when it's quiet and everyone's asleep and I get ready to start my day. And a lot of the times it has something to do with Molly. Like, she wanted to be the center of my universe so often, and now she's gone, and I'm like, girl, you the center. I have been telling your story for years now. I've got her book next to me, her pictures. I wear her necklace. I'm like, I feel closer to her now than I really ever have.
Didn't she shit on you one time as a seagull?
She did.
She really won't leave you alone. She's obsessed with you.
I don't think I've told this to anybody, but where she shit on me the first time with the seagull, where I released her ashes. I said, show me a sign, like a real sign, not like a butterfly or a dragonfly, like show me. The bird crapped all over my back, so much so that we had to use multiple towels to wipe it off. It was disgusting. My fiance was dry heaving. I was like, Molly. And then we went back in May, we went back to that same spot and we got engaged there. Oh. And right after we proposed, I set my camera up because it's quarantine. So we're in masks and totally social distancing. And we set up the camera to take a picture on the timer. And I pressed, take the picture, and the photo goes and goes. We took like 10 in a row. And all of a sudden I look over and a bird poops right next to us. I mean, splatters all over the concrete next to us. And I just looked at my fiance and I was like, she did it again.
She's
just
back.
Right there. I'm like, she's pooping all over.
And that is a sense of humor that you two share. It's just so perfect.
So gross and morbid and twisted. But I feel her in the mornings, and she guides me in my choices. She guides me when I'm telling her story. I feel her actually right now with you and me. I feel her in this interview. But it comes up. And when it comes up, I can't breathe. Yeah. It's hard. But this is exactly how she wanted to be remembered. So I feel very honored to be able to tell her story.
Oh, Nikki and I had a little cry after the microphones were turned off in that interview. We both very much felt that Molly was in the room with us, even though we weren't in the room with each other. We kind of just felt her around, and we felt it in the connection that we kind of had with each other. It was really interesting. And that happens sometimes. You just talk to someone and you just feel like you've known them for a really long time. I did not get shat on by a bird. So she wasn't that close to me, but maybe that was because I was inside and not on a beach. You are no doubt going to want to hear more of Nikki's show with Molly, Dying for Sex. You are going to want to dive deep. You're going to want to know what Molly looks like, what Nikki looks like. That's certainly what I did when I started listening to the show. And then I found the Instagram account that Molly had created with all the sexy selfies that she used to take and send to people and just take for herself. So we will put all those links in the show notes. And the other thing that you'll appreciate if you've listened to the Dying for Sex podcast is how much Molly wanted to finish her book before she died. And she did. And now you can buy it. And I've read it, and she's a really good writer. It's a great book. Molly's book is called Screw Cancer, Becoming Whole. You can get it on Kindle. All the details are at dyingforsexpodcast.com. And you can follow Nikki at Nikki Boyer. That's NIKKIBOYER on Instagram. I hope you enjoyed this episode of No Filter. If you did, it would be a huge help to me and everyone involved in making this show if you went and left a review wherever you get your podcast. That helps people discover it and it helps us keep on making it. This episode was produced by Leah Porges. The executive producer of No Filter is Eliza Ratliff. I'm Mia Freedman and I'll see you on mamamia.com.au.